Amateur mushroom cultivation is becoming more and more popular. Here's how to inoculate wild mushroom mycelium in your own garden. This method gives 100% success in growing mushrooms, but you must stick to a few key tips. Boletes, chanterelles, morels, and even truffles. To sow mushrooms in your garden, you will need a mushroom of the species you want to grow, fresh baker's yeast and sugar. To grow wild mushrooms in your own garden, you need mycelium and spores. When going mushroom picking, also take the overripe mushrooms with you. The so-called mushroom peels, like peeled stems, roots and cut-off caps, will also be useful. The mushrooms needed for mycelium application should be fully developed and mature, so that they contain both spores from the cap and mycelium from the stem. Therefore, you need a cap and a root. They may be worm-infested, but it would be good if they were not completely moldy or dry. The mushroom caps contain mushroom spores, from which mushrooms spread in nature, and the root contains the mycelium needed for the mushroom's development. It is not enough to just sprinkle mushrooms under the trees in the garden. Although this method is often used, it is not sufficient for the development of mushrooms. Here's what you need to do. So, collect the mushrooms and put all the parts in a bucket. The next step is to activate the yeast, which will awaken the fungus spores. Dissolve a cube of fresh yeast in a glass of warm, but not hot, water. It should be around 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. This is the optimal temperature for yeast multiplication. Add 3 tablespoons of sugar and 3 tablespoons of flour, mix and set aside for an hour. Sugar is a source of food for yeast and flour for mushrooms. Sugar is also a growth stimulator for mycelium. Yeast is a type of microscopic fungi that has the unusual ability to multiply quickly. Yeast is common in nature. They live on the soil or rotting fallen fruit, for example as a whitish coating on the skin of decaying plums. However, wild yeasts function as they want, in an unpredictable way. There are relatively few of them and they are unable to consume and process complex sugars. 1 gram of baker's yeast cube contains about 25 billion yeast cells. To live, they must eat. Various types of sugars feed the yeast. It can be fruit sugar, but also plain white sugar. Depending on the type of yeast, they perform different functions. Yeast supports many organisms in nature, protecting them against diseases or facilitating healthy functioning as well as reproduction and further proper development. Research conducted by scientists from the Iraqi Journal of Agricultural Sciences in 2013 showed an increase in oyster mushroom yield by 50% after adding yeast. The results showed that yield and biological efficiency increased with increasing yeast extract concentration. After waiting an hour for the yeast to activate, add it to the mushrooms and add rainwater. It cannot contain chlorine, because it kills all fungi, viruses, and bacteria. There are billions or even trillions of spores in one mushroom. Therefore, it does not take much to inoculate the mycelium. The minimum dose is 1 liter of water for 1 large mushroom, a teaspoon of sugar and 5 tablespoons of yeast. You can even dilute this solution in a barrel of water. Then the whole thing should be crushed well, for example by crushing it in your hands or grinding the contents in a food processor. Cover such a mixture with a cloth or lid and leave it outside for 2 to 3 weeks in the shade. It must have access to oxygen. In many fungi, the period between spore germination and the entry of the mycelium into the plant cell may last, depending on conditions, from 5 to several dozen days. It takes anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months to grow mushroom mycelium in the lab. When spores fall on wet material, most spores do not germinate. In addition to water, they need a physical or chemical activator. To grow mycelium, a food source called substrate is used, for example organic residues, litter, peat, and even rice or straw, depending on the type of mushroom. Food for them can be also, for example, flour. The mycelium then decomposes and transforms the substrate in a fermentation process similar to that in yogurt. The longest living part of the fungal organism, the mycelium, consists of complex filaments only 1 cell wall thick. Despite its delicate structure, mycelium is quite powerful, growing for months, years, and potentially centuries. Mycelium can move through sometimes inhospitable ecosystems. It is able to expand its reach into a habitat filled with millions of microbes, communicating chemically with the surrounding environment, developing complex chemical reactions to any challenges it encounters. The hyphae feed, grow and branch to form a colony and can later form fungi. Hyphae can also be grown, for example, on agar in the laboratory. Hyphae need O2 and produce CO2 just like animals. If a spore lands where there is moisture and food, it may be able to grow and produce hyphae. Mushrooms have to produce so many spores because most spores simply die where they land, for lack of water and food. The next stage is to find a suitable place in the garden. It must have favorable conditions for the development of fungi, so it must be warm and humid. Therefore, it should be a wet place, slightly heated by the sun, but not so much that the soil completely dries out periodically. Look for places on the lawn covered with moss or other mushrooms. Another important element of successful mushroom cultivation is a tree suitable for a given mushroom species, from whose roots the mushroom will produce mycorrhiza and enter into symbiosis. Without it, the mushroom will not grow. Each species of fungus has different requirements for trees. It is best if they are relatively young trees, between 5 and 10 years old. That's why so many mushrooms grow, for example in forest nurseries. We sow pine boletus near coniferous trees such as pine. Boletus edulis likes pine, spruce, beech and oak. Chanterelle grows under pine, spruce, oak, beech and hornbeam. Brown bolete under pine and spruce. Birch bolete under birch, common bolete under pine, larch and spruce. Morels like pine and spruce bark with an admixture of sawdust, ash from burnt wood and plaster. However, truffles like poplars, oaks, hazel, willows and beeches and require alkaline limestone soil above 7.5 pH. If you don't have trees in your garden or your garden is too small, plant the mycelium in the forest in a place that only you will know. Dig holes around the tree at a distance of 50 centimeters to 5 meters, 15 centimeters deep and about 40 centimeters in diameter. The larger the diameter of the tree trunk, the further we can dig holes. The optimal distance will be 10 tree trunk diameters. The tree's roots reach twice the size of the tree's crown itself. Fill the holes with garden soil with peat, preferably deacidified or soil from the forest if you have it. Then pour about 2 liters of the mushroom mixture into each. Cover with soil and a substrate that will retain moisture, for example bark. It can be from a bag from shop. It also often contains fungal spores like morels. You can also use forest litter with needles, leaves, or twigs. In natural conditions, mushrooms often grow on fallen, rotting trees. It is also worth placing such small logs in the garden, drilling holes and watering them with the substance, covering them with soil and watering them. Next, water each place where the mycelium has been inoculated with a bucket of rainwater. The best time for such sowing is when it is in nature. So if we currently have an abundance of bay bolete or bolete in the forest in September, we do it this month. There are then optimal conditions that will guarantee the survival and development of the mycelium. If mushrooms spread their spores from under their caps in a given month, this will be the best time. If rainfall is low, the newly inoculated place with mycelium should be watered regularly. In good conditions, mushrooms will appear after 2 years. The mycelium will bear fruit for about 4 years or longer, so it is worth supplementing the substrate with new mycelium. Remember that the appearance of mushrooms also depends on weather conditions. It happens that one year we have plenty of mushrooms in the forests, and there are also years when they are absent. If you haven't found the mushrooms of the species you want to grow in the forest, you can buy mycelium in the online store. Dealing with purchased mycelium is very similar. To ensure that the mycelium in your garden is preserved and does not dry out, you need to control the soil moisture, water it and feed the mycelium with water and sugar. If you are interested in growing particular species of mushrooms, please watch my other videos where I discuss the cultivation of a given species in detail.